One thing I hear a word you use, and I'll make sure I pronounce this right, is it univocality or something like that?
Univocality, yeah.
Univocality. And you mentioned how that is kind of I guess an issue in some ways because it's kind of an assumption that many people come to the Bible with. And I think it is, I think the way in which we view books in general, we view books as, unless it's in the table of contents where the chapters are all written by different authors, we view the books to be just one piece of work. Whereas with the Bible, a lot of times, and even I have done this and grew up in this, is coming with the idea that the Bible is just one voice. What can be the, I guess, issue in reading that in that way? And like, I guess, what are some examples that we can see where maybe the data doesn't support that,
Yeah.
maybe in the text?
So I think the biggest threat of doing that is because if we come to it assuming that it all has one single unified voice, then when we get to two texts where the original authors may have flatly disagreed with each other, in fact, there are some places where one author is writing specifically to disagree with another writer, we need to make them agree. And what that usually means is holding up the one we already agree with and then finding a way to silence the other one and reread it in a way that agrees with the author that they probably originally vehemently disagreed with. And so it does, I think it does harm to the text. It silences biblical authors in the interest of preserving this assumption about the Bible. And so we misunderstand a lot of texts in the Bible. And the easiest example to point to, one that I think is pretty classic, is James and Paul, where you have James seems to be directly quoting Paul in Romans, where he talks about Abraham. Now we see that Abraham was justified by faith and not by works. And then James says, and so we see a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. And they both just finished telling the story of Abraham offering his only son. And that's one that's, I think, and many scholars think, that James is disagreeing with Paul, saying, no, Paul's got it wrong here. But with the Reformation, with Luther, who didn't like this, put James in the back in the appendix of his original translation, called it the Epistle of Straw. Ever since then, we've come up with all kinds of different hermeneutic tricks, for lack of a kinder word, to make James agree with Paul. And a lot of ink and blood has been spilled on trying to make James agree with Paul. And I think that just does violence to James, to silence what he was trying to say, just because we need them to agree, because of the ideology that we bring to the text. And I think this shows that for many people, the Bible is not in charge. It's our assumptions about what the Bible is supposed to be that is in charge of how we read it. And that is one of the demonstrations, in my opinion, of how we don't get doctrine from the Bible. We get doctrine from identity politics and other things, and the Bible is just our justification. It's just our excuse. And yeah, I think racism and slavery is another thing where you've had people arguing from both sides of that. During in the early 19th century in America, you had preachers preaching abolition based on the Bible, and then you had other preachers preaching slavery based on the Bible, because the texts have no meaning in and of themselves. They only have meaning to the degree that readers create meaning. And so there's a lot of different things we can make them say. And if we expect them to say certain things, they're going to say those things.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the first examples I had come across of just not realize, for a long time, I just assumed what I was told, that, for instance, like with the Pentateuch being Mosaic authorship.
Yeah.
And I think it's JDEP. Is that what it? Yeah. So that was the first time I had ever come across this idea of like, oh wait, there's like a lot of different influences going into why certain portions of the Pentateuch are written this way and others are written this way, whether it be in regards to sacrificial stuff or whatever other things. And when I came across that, I was like, oh wow, this is very different than what I had thought. And I think that most Christians come to the Bible with the univocality viewpoint. I've heard my whole life pretty much that all verses point to Jesus, and it's kind of a. I actually had a professor in college that was like, no, they don't, and I was like, wait a second, I thought they did. So I think that stuff is really, I think, necessary for rethinking and approaching it. And I think I've always felt like when you do that, you begin to value the text a little more because it requires you to actually respect it and not just like kind of just throw your hands up at it. It says what it says. It means what it means.
Yeah.
And I've found that to be pretty helpful.
And I think it makes it a lot easier to resonate with the text when these are human issues going on, and we can see that this author is struggling with something, is trying to communicate something, is wants you to respond in a certain way. That makes it more human and easier to relate with. Because I never related to the text. I've seen people talk about, just everything's about Jesus and just want to praise Jesus 24/7. It's like, that does not interest me. That does not sound exciting. And so if the texts say that, I am not interested in those texts. But when I get into them and I see the human element in them and see, oh, they're trying to structure power. They don't like the king, or they don't like this group of priests over here, and they want to make it's more interesting to me. That's a soap opera that I'll watch. But yeah, for some, because their identities depend upon a specific perspective, they don't, they have those guardrails up. They won't let themselves look at it that way.
Yeah.